Ring Out Wild Bells by Wolcott Gibbs. Our production, A Midsummer Night's Dream, was given on the open-air stage at Riverdale Country School shortly before the war. The scenery was only the natural scenery of that suburban dell, and the cast was exclusively male, ranging in age from 11 to perhaps 17. It must be admitted that our version had its drawbacks. The costumes were probably the worst things we had to bear because we were costumed by our parents. My costume for the character Puck was mysterious but spectacular. Beginning at the top, there was a cat with 3 stuffed horns, and then a pair of tights that covered me from my wrists to my ankles, and finally, slippers with stuffed toes that curled up at the ends. The whole thing was made out of silk in alternate green and red stripes and was covered from head to foot with 1,000 tiny bells. Because our costumes were obviously perishable, we never wore them in rehearsal, and actually, nobody knew I was invested with such peculiar sound effects until I made my entrance at the beginning of the second act. Our director was a man who had strong opinions on how Shakespeare should be played. It was his theory that Puck was in the incarnation of mischief. So I had been instructed to bound onto the stage. And once there, to dance up and down, cocking my head and waving my arms. I had my own misgivings about those dangerously abundant gestures and their probable effect on my bells. It was too late, however, to invent another technique for playing Puck. I bounded onto the stage. The effect in its way must have been superb. With every leap, I rang like 1,000 children's sleighs. It became even worse when I went to the middle of the stage and went into my gestures. To a blind man, it must have sounded as though I had recklessly accompanied myself to the xylophone. Puck's first remark is addressed to one of the fairies. "How now, spirits, whither wander you? This poor child, already embarrassed by a public appearance in cheesecloth and tinsel, was also burdened with an opening speech of 16 lines in verse." He began bravely. "Over hill, over dale, through brush, through briar, over park, over pale, through flood, through fire." At the word fire, my instruction was to bring my hands up from the ground in a long, wavering sweep, intended to represent fire. The bells pealed. The fairy stopped in his lines and looked at me sharply. "I do wander everywhere. Swifter than the moon's sphere." Here again I had another cue for a sort of swoop and dip, indicating the swiftness of the moon's sphere. Again the bells rang out, and again the performance stopped in its tracks. The fairy was clearly troubled by these remarks. He had, however, a child's strange acceptance of the inscrutable, and was even able to regard my bells as a last-minute adult addition to the program. My turn, when it came, was even worse. By this time, the audience had succumbed to a helpless gaiety. I began my speech. "Louder! You will have to talk louder! It was the director, and for heaven's sake, stop that jingling!" I talked louder, and I tried to stop the jingling, but it was no use. By the time I got to the end of my speech, I was shouting, and so was the audience. All this had a very bad effect on the fairy, who by this time had symptoms of a complete nervous collapse. However, he began his speech. Either I mistake your shape in making white, or you're that shrewd and knavish sprite called Robin Goodfellow. Are you not he that... By this point, I had forgotten the rules had been changed, and I was supposed to leave out the gestures. There was a furious jingling, and fairy gulped. Are you not he that... He looked miserably at the wings, and the director supplied the next line for him, but the tumult was too much for him. The unhappy child shook his head. Say anything at all. The fairy shut his eyes and shuddered. All right, Huck, you begin your next speech. By some miracle, I actually did remember my next lines, and I'd opened my mouth to say them when suddenly the fairy spoke. His voice was a high, thin monotone, and there seemed to be madness in it, but it was clear. It was perfectly clear. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived. He said it right through to the end. And it was certainly the most successful speech ever made on that stage. And possibly the most successful speech ever made on any stage. I don't know if I ever knew how the rest of us picked up the dull, normal thread of the play after that extraordinary performance. But we must have, because I know it went on. The last thing I remember is that in the next intermission, the director cut off my belt with his penknife. And after that, things quieted down and got dull.